Few franchises have managed to resonate as deeply with audiences as Konami's Castlevania. Since its debut in 1986, the series has transcended its medium, blending gothic horror, intricate storytelling, and innovative gameplay mechanics to create a cultural phenomenon. The significance of Castlevania lies not only in its ability to entertain, but also in its profound influence on game design and narrative structure. The original Castlevania, developed for the NES, introduced players to Simon Belmont, a vampire hunter armed with a whip and a fierce determination to rid the world of Dracula. This foundational title set the stage for what would become a hallmark of the series, a rich, atmospheric world steeped in myth and lore. The combination of action platforming gameplay and a haunting soundtrack established a template that many games would follow, paving the way for the horror action-adventure genre. As the franchise evolved, so too did its mechanics. The introduction of the Metroidvania genre with Castlevania Symphony of the Night in 1997 marked a seismic shift in game design. This title embraced exploration, character progression, and a non-linear structure that encouraged players to uncover the dark secrets of Dracula's castle. Here, Castlevania became more than just a battle against evil. It transformed into a journey of discovery. This innovation inspired countless titles in the years that followed, illustrating how Castlevania was not just a series, but a catalyst for change in the industry. It continued to evolve across gaming platforms over time as beautifully rendered 3D games for the new generation of consoles like the PS2, Xbox, PS3, and Xbox 360. It's now even gone on to have its very own anime series, which, for the most part, has a solid fan base and is admired by fans of the gaming franchise. However, hidden away within the Castlevania franchise's rich history lies a small footnote of a game spin-off to the series that, for some gamers, is an important part of Castlevania's history, and for others, feels like a fever dream, or they didn't even know it existed. Kid Dracula, a family-friendly side-scrolling game based on the world of Castlevania, released by Konami in 1993 for the original Gameboy. Now, there are two reasons that most gamers at times are either confused by its existence or didn't even know the title existed. The first is that originally, Kid Dracula was released for the first time on the NES back in 1990, not for the Game Boy in 1993. The 1990 release of Kid Dracula was a Japan-only release and never made it to the shores of North America. The second was marketing. There was little to no marketing for this game. Not to mention, it was also incredibly difficult to convince gamers to invest in Game Boy games that weren't associated with the Nintendo family of characters. Kid Dracula had a more lighthearted comedic tone compared to its more serious counterparts. Given that Kid Dracula was a niche title, Konami likely decided it wasn't worth the investment for a broader release outside of Japan. Because of this, upon the Game Boy release in 1993 for the North American market, it was essentially a sequel, but gamers in North America didn't really have any background about the game being associated with Castlevania, or that this game title had a first predecessor. The game just most likely fell under many gamers' radars. But at Nintendo's request, Konami embarked on developing a sequel for the Game Boy in order for the handheld device to get more support from AAA game developers, and thus Kid Dracula ended up having its sequel released for the Game Boy worldwide under the same title as the first 1990 game release for the NES. Now, this is not the first example of a game spin-off having minor fanfare or minimal notoriety within the gaming landscape. Games like The Misadventures of Tron from the Mega Man Legends games or Metal Gear Rising are other examples of games that had little to no real success but have gone on to become cult classics as spin-offs. And sometimes with these spin-offs, their original physical copies fall into the territory of obscurity or end up having retro game gaming price tags that fall into the category of sheer madness. And yes, Kid Dracula happens to also be a game where its physical copy is ridiculously priced. If you have a copy of it, even just the cartridge, you should hang on to it for dear life. Kid Dracula for the Game Boy was a very slept-on game at the time, yet it has a very loyal cult following and appreciation from gamers who either played it or owned it upon its release. In 2019, Kid Dracula for the NES was finally released to the entire world with English translations on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection for the first time, something that I was personally very happy about. With Kid Dracula, I have a long-standing relationship with it, as it was my third Game Boy game I ever got as a child as a birthday gift, and it's gotta be one of my most admired games for the original Game Boy. The thing is, it was just one of these games I could never beat as a child, as it was a surprisingly challenging game for me way back in 1993. As years passed and new consoles got released, it was a game that ended up quietly collecting dust on my shelf. That is, until now. And so for this Halloween episode of the Select Gaming, I finally delve into Kid Dracula for the original Game Boy and begin my journey of finally completing this game title, and ask the question, is Kid Dracula for the original Game Boy a worthy entry as a spin-off game for the Castlevania franchise? Or is it something that Konami should leave for the ghouls and ghosts of yesteryear to devour? Subscribe to the Select Gaming to keep up to date with all our latest videos. This is Kid Dracula for the Select Gaming. Originally, Kid Dracula emerged from the creative minds at Konami in 1990 to be a standalone spin-off title. It was born out of an effort to explore a more family-friendly game that would be developed for the Nintendo Famicom, as this was something that Nintendo as a company wanted to have first and foremost as its brand identity at the time. Rather than straying too far from Konami's current direction of game making, the company decided to stay in the realm of castles and vampires, but to make it less dark and more in the vein of a Super Mario Bros. Game. So in replace of playing a character like Simon Belmont who whipped his way through zombies and vampires, Konami decided to put the gamer on the other side of the fence, where you played as a young Kid Dracula who embodied all the powers that a young vampire would have to fend off enemies. In Kid Dracula for the Game Boy, we are introduced to a charming, youthful iteration of the legendary vampire. Here, a young Dracula embarks on a whimsical quest to once again defeat his arch-nemesis, Garamoth, and protect his castle. The narrative unfolds as he faces a colorful cast of horror-themed adversaries, as you are allied with your loyal servant Death to help give you advice and training in the game, along with your cute and cuddly bat companions. The adventure begins with our young protagonist waking up from a long slumber, only to find out from Death that Garamoth has returned once again from the unknown depths to challenge him and his throne. Dracula must navigate a series of meticulously designed levels, each filled with platforming challenges and quirky foes. As he progresses, he collects an array of power-ups that enhance his abilities, setting the stage for increasingly difficult confrontations. However, Kid Dracula has forgotten how to do most of his spells from this long nap. So after each stage, Death will help train Kid Dracula via mini tutorials on how to use your spells and abilities to progress in the game. Kid Dracula invites players into a world where whimsy triumphs over darkness, proving that even the most iconic monsters can have a playful side. The game story is told through cutscenes that come with some fun dialogue and an entertaining cast of characters that help Kid Dracula on his journey to defeat Garamoth. The core mechanics of Kid Dracula's gameplay draws heavily from the platforming genre, reminiscent of titles like Castlevania, but infused with a unique flair. Players navigate through a variety of levels, each filled with colorful enemies, obstacles, and power-ups to beat a variety of levels within a given stage of the game, and it's up to the player to decide what the best approach is to overcoming the enemies and obstacles that stand in your way. The controls are straightforward, allowing for smooth movement and responsive jumps. In the beginning of the game, you'll start off with 3 hearts, and it's up to you to find heart canisters throughout the levels to gain more life to max your health bars to a greater number and keep it that way. At the heart of Kid Dracula's gameplay is its engaging combat system. Initially, Kid Dracula possesses a basic fire attack and an even larger fireball attack to start off with. But eventually, throughout your progression in the game, you'll then be able to learn new abilities where you'll gain upgraded attacks and useful skills that will help you in the game. These new abilities being more powerful projectiles and elemental attacks. Things like being able to turn into a bat to fly over gaps too big to jump, a homing attack that locks onto your enemies, walking upside down to overcome obstacles, and being able to use an umbrella to shield yourself from objects that pose a threat to your safety are all part of some of the abilities and skills you'll learn along the way. You'll learn these new skills and abilities after a stage via a tutorial given to you by your loyal companion Death, that you'll then carry with you in your inventory by navigating to a given skill by using the select button. To use these special powers, hold the B button down until Kid Dracula flashes at the bottom of the screen, then release the button. The ability to combine power-ups adds a strategic layer as players can experiment with different attack types to tackle various enemies and bosses. With regards to using any long-range special attacks, after defeating your enemy, their deceased corpse will release a token coin which can later be used as currency in the minigames after every stage. I guess in the lore of Kid Dracula, the souls of mortals are made up of coins, which is probably why my ex-wife tried to bleed me dry of every single penny. Wait, what? Overall, there is a lot of depth with regards to the gameplay and strategy that you'll have to use in Kid Dracula, and to be honest, at times, it's actually a very challenging game, especially for a Game Boy title. There were a few times that either had me scratching my head at what to do next or how to approach certain boss battles, particularly the boss where you essentially have to aim for his head while using the upside down ability. I'm not ashamed to say that I didn't know that this was the approach at first, and I was trying to defeat this guy with my boots on the ground, jumping and throwing my fireball attack at him, but with no success. There is a lot of trial and error in these boss battles, and figuring out what ability to use on the bosses is one half of the battle, and the other half is recognizing their pattern of movement so you know when to attack. The minigames in Kid Dracula are something that you'll actually have a lot of fun with, and the best way to describe them is that they feel like something that is sort of out of the Mario Party games. Short time limit games that present fun and unique challenges, and where you get to gamble your way through some of the games where you could potentially win more coins or partake in some of the fun challenges like popping balloons while jumping on a pogo stick, or seeing how many bats you can catch in a net that fly out of trees to earn more lives. The minigames are a very welcomed section and addition to the game, and it really does help with getting some of those extra lives in between stages. But just as a word of warning, Kid Dracula is a password-based game, meaning when you pass a stage, you'll be able to ask Death for a password where you can return to the stage you left off in by inputting that password. But the lives you accumulated will disappear when you restart the game and go back to only having 3 lives. Kid Dracula is a game that encourages you to finish it in one sitting. For a Game Boy game, this is a very graphically impressive game. When you compare it to a game like, for example, Mario Land for the Game Boy, you can clearly see that Konami was pushing the hardware of the Game Boy significantly in the detail of the sprites and the level design. The game's art style maintained a cohesive theme throughout, blending cute and spooky elements effectively. This artistic choice helped create a unique identity that would resonate with players, differentiating it from more traditional-looking Game Boy games. The fluidity of the character animations was impressive for the Game Boy, showcasing Konami's ability to push the hardware limits. Smooth movements and well-timed actions made the gameplay feel more polished and responsive. However, I will say that at times there are some moments where the game is doing a lot of things and does suffer from extreme lag, where back in the day it almost made me think that my Game Boy was going to explode. The most notorious level where the lag is present is in the standing roller coaster level in Stage 3. Not only is it one of the hardest levels, but with all the jumping, moving, animations, and other characters popping into the screen that are trying to kill you, it's doing so much that it bogs down the gameplay and starts to stutter, adding to the overall difficulty. I commend Konami for trying to break the Game Boy hardware. I'd even go so far to say that Kid Dracula is one of the most advanced looking and playing Game Boy titles, and it almost makes it feel on par with an NES game. Even though it lags at times, it is very forgiving, and it usually lasts for about 2 to 3 seconds after complicated animation plays out, so do not fret. I'd say that aside from the occasional lag, the only other real thing that bothered me more at times was the real estate that Kid Dracula occupies on the screen. The original Game Boy screen is relatively small, measuring just 160 by 144 pixels. This limited real estate means that every element on the screen must carefully be considered to maximize visibility and playability. The size of the bottom menu box in Kid Dracula occupies a significant portion of the screen. This menu displays the player's current health, abilities, and your coin collection. While it's crucial for the gameplay, its size does obscure important visual cues in the game, such as enemy movements and platform placements in any given moment, and it does make it rather difficult to navigate around at certain points. A screen layout like this is a more palatable design layout that works much better in the NES Kid Dracula game, where there was much more room for something like this. But for the Game Boy game, a more streamlined or minimized version of the bottom menu could have helped alleviate these issues. But in retrospect, this is probably something that may have been unavoidable given the amount of detail emphasized in the text and symbols. I played this version of the game that you're seeing right now as an emulated game on a 40-inch HD TV, and I still had trouble at times trying to see things or move around. So really, this is just something that gamers will have to get used to when playing the Game Boy version of this game. And speaking of the NES version of Kid Dracula, how do both the NES and Game Boy versions of Kid Dracula fare out from one another? Both charming in their own right, but they offer distinct experiences due to differences in gameplay mechanics, graphics, and overall design. Now, the obvious difference is the graphics. If you play Kid Dracula on the original Game Boy, you'll get the famous mucus green color that will lovingly permeate the background of the sprites, whereas the NES version, of course, boasts full color in 8-bit. However, like I mentioned, this playthrough was played on an emulated game, so I was able to get a much better looking black and white version of Kid Dracula, where I will say I honestly prefer this emulated Game Boy version over the colored NES version. It feels more fitting as it definitely gives off an old school monster movie Nosferatu vibe to it. The NES version boasts more detailed graphics with a richer color palette and larger character sprites, thanks to the system's greater graphical capabilities. The backgrounds are more elaborate, featuring parallax scrolling that adds depth to the environments. The overall art style retains a whimsical cartoonish charm that enhances the game's lighthearted tone. The Game Boy version features its flat, one-color graphics for a handheld system. The limitations of the hardware mean smaller sprites and a more constrained color palette. Despite this, the game successfully captures the essence of the NES version's art and style, albeit with simplified designs. The characters and environments are still vibrant, but they lack some of the detail found in the NES counterpart. The NES version offers a more traditional platforming experience with multiple levels and diverse environments. Players similarly collect various power-ups that enhance Kid Dracula's abilities, including a variety of attacks. The game also has a somewhat higher difficulty, requiring players to master the mechanics to progress. The gameplay in the Game Boy version is similar and once again adapted for handheld play. However, it boasts a completely different story and does act as a sequel to the first game. The controls are responsive, but some players may find the screen layout, particularly the bottom menu, restrictive. The level design remains engaging, but the overall pacing feels slightly more forgiving compared to the NES version, making it more accessible for casual players. The NES levels are expansive, featuring intricate designs and numerous secrets to discover. Each stage presents a mix of platforming challenges and enemy encounters, with bosses that require pattern recognition and strategy. While while the level design in the Game Boy version is still creative and enjoyable, the stages tend to be shorter and less complex, aligning with the expectations of portable gaming. This makes the experience feel a bit more streamlined, which can be a positive for quick play sessions. The abilities and gameplay style overall are almost identical, with some differences with regards to the levels in both games due to the different narrative that unfolds. Both versions of Kid Dracula share a common foundation and appeal. They cater to different gaming experiences. The NES version offers a more graphically rich and traditional challenging platforming experience, making it a favorite among fans of the genre. In contrast, the Game Boy version excels in providing a portable, accessible adaptation that retains much of the charm and fun of the original, making it suitable for on-the-go play. Ultimately, the choice between the two comes down to a personal preference and the context in which players wish to enjoy the game. For me, the definitive version of Kid Dracula will always be its Game Boy version and sequel, as it was for so many years for Western gamers the only version we were able to play until recently, where the NES version was made available in 2019. And in all honesty, the Game Boy version does a lot of things much better, believe it or not, especially when it comes to the cutscenes and how the story is told. Kid Dracula fits into the broader Castlevania universe as a playful spin-off that contrasts sharply with the darker themes of the main series. This young version of Dracula is a direct nod to the iconic vampire character of the Castlevania series. His adventures involve reclaiming his title, creating a lighthearted narrative that plays off of the traditional vampire storylines found in Castlevania. Many enemies in Kid Dracula are reminiscent of classic Castlevania foes, such as skeletons, zombies, and other supernatural characters. Their designs are more kid-friendly, but they maintain a connection to the familiar enemy types that players encounter in the main series. While Kid Dracula is primarily a platformer, it incorporates elements familiar to Castlevania fans, such as the power-ups and boss battles. The gameplay mechanics echo those of the series, but in a more accessible and less punishing manner. Kid Dracula could also be viewed as existing in an alternate universe within the Castlevania franchise. This allowed Konami to have more creative freedom in the storytelling and gameplay without adhering strictly to the established lore of the main Castlevania series. Kid Dracula contains numerous references to the broader Castlevania mythos, including character names, enemy types, and thematic elements. These nods create a connection to the franchise, enriching the experience for fans who recognize them. The NES version of Kid Dracula has sparked some controversy and discussion amongst fans and critics over the years, as this is primarily centered around the first boss battle. In the original Japanese Famicom release of Kid Dracula, the first boss features a manji symbol on its forehead, something that does not exist in the Game Boy version of the game's first boss, who makes a reappearance in the sequel. This Buddhist icon, specifically in Jainism, represents balance and embodies concepts like love, mercy, strength, and intelligence. However, due to its appropriation by the former German political group that rhymes with the board game Yahtzee, the manji has unfortunately become associated with hate groups in many parts of the world, particularly outside of East Asia, where it is often conflated with the Yahtzee party symbol. Not to mention that a ghost that looks like a person wearing a white robe that seemingly could also be compared to other hate groups for people who have no context that this is a ghost, and we have a big ol' controversy burger that is ripe for the picking for the current landscape of cancel culture to go buck wild on Kid Dracula, especially if it is being taken out of context within the realm of Jainism and this boss being a ghost in a game filled with ghosts and ghouls. The international release of the Kid Dracula NES edition made significant changes. The manji symbol is removed entirely, and the top of the boss's ghost head was redesigned to be rounder, further minimizing any visual resemblance to figures associated with any hate groups. These alterations highlighted the game designer's effort to navigate the complex cultural sensitivities surrounding symbols and imagery, ensuring a more universally palatable experience for players. Having a game like Kid Dracula on the Game Boy is significant for several reasons, both within the context of the gaming industry and for players themselves. The presence of Kid Dracula on the Game Boy is important for its contribution to the diversity of the platform's library, its accessibility, and its charming aesthetic. It provided a fun, engaging experience that would resonate with a wide range of players while also enriching the Castlevania universe. As a beloved cult classic, it exemplifies how a game can offer both entertainment and cultural significance in the gaming landscape. Most importantly, a game like Kid Dracula displayed that the Game Boy had strong third-party support from established developers like Konami. Konami was already a well-known name in the gaming industry, especially for its successful franchises like Castlevania, Contra, and Metal Gear. Their decision to develop Kid Dracula for the Game Boy demonstrated confidence in the platform and helped legitimize it as a viable gaming system. The inclusion of titles like Kid Dracula contributed significantly to the Game Boy's software library, helping to attract a broader audience. Strong third-party support allowed the system to compete more effectively against rivals like the Sega Game Gear. While the Game Boy is known for its wide range of titles, it is true that many games were puzzle-oriented or featured simpler gameplay mechanics. Sadly, the Game Boy was a haven for lackluster puzzle games. Kid Dracula is seen as a high note in the Game Boy's library as time has passed. The support from Konami was crucial in expanding the console's library, enriching its reputation, and driving the commercial success of the Game Boy. Konami stands at a crossroad. In recent years, they shifted away from traditional game development and moved towards pachinko machines and mobile games, something that I never thought I would see in my wildest dreams from the company that brought us Solid Snake. Konami's shift towards pachinko machines and mobile games reflected a strategic response to market dynamics and changing consumer preferences, specifically in the Japanese market. This move had drawn significantly negative criticism from fans longing for more traditional gaming experiences, but it aligned with the company's efforts to remain profitable in a rapidly evolving industry. But as of late, we are now seemingly seeing a shift in Konami's business strategy. It would seem that they are slowly moving back into traditional video games. The success of the Silent Hill 2 remake is a significant development in the gaming landscape, reflecting both nostalgia for classic horror games and the potential for modern adaptations. Seemingly, the expectation for this remake was incredibly low amongst gamers, but has been celebrated and praised amongst gamers and critics alike. And now with the Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater remake, it further reflects that Konami is delving into its legacy and looking to ease its way back into the gaming world once again, establishing trust with gamers in crafting out these two iconic games as remakes to reset their bearings. I honestly would not be surprised if this eventually leads to more original Silent Hill games, along with new Metal Gear games and Castlevania games in the near future. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, in a small way, I always knew Konami had it in them to make a comeback. And with them delving into their legacy titles, who knows? Is Kid Dracula on Konami's list of possible future game titles? There is a crazy amount of potential with a character like Kid Dracula from the game mechanics and art direction that would translate so incredibly well with the current state of console technology. I mean, is it that much of a pipe dream to think we could get a Kid Dracula game built in Unreal Engine when they have recently just brought Silent Hill back from the dead? Konami's comeback has generated excitement among gamers and industry analysts alike. It reflects a renewed commitment to quality gaming experiences, the revival of beloved franchises, and a willingness to adapt to the changing landscape of the industry. Here's hoping that a Kid Dracula game title lies somewhere within Konami's future for all gamers, old and new, to partake in. And if not, we will always have the NES and Game Boy games to look back on in Konami's illustrious gaming history. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Select Gaming. If you like what you've seen and heard, give us a like and subscribe. This is Dusty Maxwell, and I hope that you all have a happy Halloween. We'll see you on the next one.